The room was silent as Ambassador Eleanor York stood before the Galactic Council, the weight of the galaxy's gaze upon her. She was one of the first humans to represent Earth on such a grand scale, and her every word, every gesture, would shape humanity's future in the stars. The proposal from the Vrethka was well crafted, promising peace, cooperation, and the opportunity for humanity to join an alliance of powerful species. But there was a catch: restrictions. Humanity would be granted certain rights and freedoms, yes, but they would be limited by the Council's demands. There would be oversight, regulation of human expansion, and an agreement to align with the political interests of the most powerful factions. York knew this was not freedom. It was a gilded cage. Ambassador York, the Vrethka representative, Sorix, spoke in his calm, measured voice. We understand that humanity is a young race, eager to explore and conquer. But the galaxy is a vast place, filled with dangers that you cannot yet comprehend. We offer guidance. Guidance? York interrupted, her voice steady, though inside she could feel the tension rising. What you're offering isn't guidance, it's control. Humanity does not seek to be caged, nor to have our path dictated by others. The Vrethka's eyes narrowed, but they remained calm. The Vrethka were an ancient species, revered for their wisdom and their role as peacekeepers in the galaxy. Their words carried weight, and their offer had the potential to secure humanity's place in the galaxy. But York had studied their history. She knew that peace under the Vrethka's terms often meant subjugation, not cooperation. We recognize your strength, Sorix continued, his voice still even, though the undercurrent of frustration was growing. But strength alone does not ensure survival. This galaxy is fraught with conflict. You may find yourselves outmatched, outnumbered, and alone. It is only through unity that you will thrive. York took a deep breath. She wasn't here to make enemies, but she also wasn't about to let her people be silenced. The Vrethka might have seen their offer as a gift, but to her, it was a veiled threat. Humanity had struggled for centuries to break free from the constraints of their own planet, to escape the shadows of their past, and now they were expected to accept a similar fate among the stars. I do not deny that unity is important, she said, her voice steady and unwavering. But true unity comes from respect, not from forcing someone into a corner. We are not asking for dominion over the galaxy, nor do we expect to be handed a place of power. What we ask for is the freedom to shape our own destiny. We are not children to be guided. We are adults, ready to stand alongside you. The room buzzed with murmurs. York could feel the eyes of every representative on her. Some were skeptical, others curious, and a few were outright hostile. The Xalcor, an aggressive and highly militaristic species, exchanged glances, their sharp, reptilian eyes narrowing. They saw humanity as a potential threat, and York could already sense their growing disdain. I reject your offer, Ambassador Sorix, York said, her voice ringing clear across the chamber. Humanity will not be bound by anyone's chains. If peace is to be found, it will be on our terms or not at all. For a moment, there was only silence. The other council members waited, unsure of how to respond. The tension was thick in the air, each species waiting for the other to make the next move. The Vrethka exchanged a glance, their centuries of experience evident in the subtle shifts of their posture. You are certain of this? Sorix asked, his tone cool but carrying an edge of disappointment. You reject the peace we offer. York stood tall, her gaze unwavering. I am certain. Humanity will forge its own path. If that means we must stand apart, then so be it. With that, the meeting adjourned in uneasy silence. The representatives filed out, their thoughts swirling, unsure of how to process the defiant stance taken by a race so young, so seemingly unprepared for the complexities of galactic politics. But York knew one thing for certain. Humanity's rejection of the proposal wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The galaxy had underestimated them before. They would do so again at their peril. The Galactic Council was in chaos. The meeting hall buzzed with hushed conversations as representatives from the various species debated among themselves. Some argued that Ambassador York's rejection was a bold stand for human autonomy, while others feared it would ignite a chain reaction that could fracture the delicate balance of the galaxy. The Vrethka, typically the voice of reason, were now visibly disturbed by humanity's defiance. Their offer had been generous, but York had dismissed it without a second thought. "I told you they were not ready," growled Drakta, a towering figure from the Xal core, his sharp features contorted in frustration. His race, known for their military might, had never been interested in diplomacy, and they saw the human refusal as a direct challenge. "Now we must act. If we allow this kind of insolence to go unchecked, it will set a dangerous precedent." A murmur of agreement spread among the Xal core contingent, their eyes glinting with barely concealed aggression. They were itching for a reason to confront humanity. To them, it was simple. The strong survive, and humanity's rejection of peace made them a potential threat to be neutralized before they could become more powerful. However, the Vrethka were not so quick to escalate matters. Ambassador Sorix stood up from his seat, his ancient eyes scanning the room with quiet authority. His race prided itself on maintaining peace, often stepping in as mediators during conflicts between other species. It was in their nature to understand the value of patience and diplomacy. "We must not be hasty," Sorix said, his voice calm yet firm. "Humanity's decision is one of principle. They are not rejecting peace. They are asserting their right to self-determination. Perhaps we miscalculated in our offer. We must rethink our approach, not push them further into isolation." His words hung in the air, offering a brief flicker of hope for those who still believed diplomacy could prevail. But Sorix's plea was not met with universal support. The Mornaxi, a race of highly analytical beings with no tolerance for emotion, were quick to speak up. "The human refusal is a sign of weakness," stated a Mornaxi representative. "They are untested, unrefined, and unable to comprehend the consequences of their actions. Allowing them to maintain such autonomy could invite chaos. They are far too unpredictable. We must take control now, before their pride leads to disaster." Sorix's face remained unreadable, but his voice remained steadfast. The council was built on the idea of cooperation. If we are to succeed as a collective, we must respect the rights of all species, including humanity. We must work together, not rule over them. But it was too late. A divide was already forming. On one side of the room, the more militant races, like the Xal core and Mornaxi, whispered of measures that might force humanity's compliance, sabotage, economic sanctions, or even the use of force. On the other side, the more diplomatic factions, including the Vrethka, argued for a more measured approach, advocating for another attempt at dialogue. In the midst of the turmoil, one voice remained silent. The representatives from the Marvet, a mysterious species known for their secrecy and intelligence, observed quietly from the back of the room. Though they had little interest in the politics of the council, they had a vested interest in humanity's future. Their leaders had been quietly monitoring human progress for decades, and they had a deeper understanding of the human spirit than most species in the room realized. Unbeknownst to the rest of the council, the Marvet had already begun to make contact with select human leaders on the fringe of known space. Their motivations were unclear, but one thing was certain: they were intrigued by humanity's refusal to conform. It was a spirit that many other races had long since lost. As the meeting drew to a close, Sorix turned to Ambassador York, who had been watching the exchange from her seat. His expression was somber, but there was a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. He had not expected the rejection, but now that it had happened, he saw it for what it was: humanity's unwillingness to compromise on its core values. "You may be right, Ambassador," Sorix said quietly, his voice low enough so only she could hear. "Perhaps it is time for humanity to forge its own path. But remember this: the galaxy is not a forgiving place. There will be consequences." York nodded, her gaze unwavering. "We'll face them as they come, But humanity will never bend to anyone's will. Not now, not ever. As the council members filed out, divided and uncertain, York knew that this was just the beginning. The galaxy was in turmoil, but one thing was clear. Humanity had made its mark. They would no longer be a passive participant in the grand politics of the stars. They would stand tall, regardless of what the galaxy had in store. The news of humanity's rejection spread across the galaxy like wildfire. What had started as a quiet diplomatic failure quickly turned into a galactic spectacle. News feeds broadcasted the rejection, replaying Ambassador York's firm words, and debates ignited on countless worlds. Some saw humanity as reckless, too proud and naive to understand the complexities of galactic politics. Others saw them as brave, standing firm against overwhelming pressure from an ancient, powerful council. In the days that followed, protests erupted on dozens of planets. Across the galaxy, smaller species began to question their place within the council, some openly calling for a revaluation of the current power structure. For the first time in centuries, the larger species, those that had held the reins of the galaxy for eons, began to feel the pressure of their dominance slipping. And humanity, it seemed, had struck a nerve. Ambassador York watched as the ripple effects spread. Her communication channels were flooded with messages of support from leaders of independent systems. They admire humanity's stand, seeing in it a reflection of their own struggles against the control of the larger, more powerful races. York knew the importance of this moment. This wasn't just about rejecting the Vrethka's peace offer. It was about something far larger. Humanity was sending a message to the galaxy. We will not be dictated to. It was late into the night when York stood in her office on Earth, watching the stars outside her window. The news from the council was still fresh, and she felt the weight of the galaxy's eyes on her. There was no turning back now. As much as she'd hoped for a peaceful resolution, it seemed that the path forward would be far more turbulent. Ambassador York. A voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find her senior advisor, Admiral Harris, standing in the doorway. His expression was grim, but his voice held a note of cautious optimism. The fleet is ready for mobilization. We got support from several smaller factions, and the rest of humanity's military is ready to follow your lead if it comes to that. York felt a tightness in her chest. She had expected this moment. The moment when diplomacy failed and humanity had to prepare for the consequences of their actions. But she wasn't ready to leap into a galactic war. Not yet. Mobilize, but don't engage unless absolutely necessary, she replied. We have to show them we're not the enemy, that we are simply defending our right to exist on our own terms. Harris nodded, understanding the weight of her words. Understood, but they'll push us. The Xalcor, the Mornaxi, they see this as a challenge to their dominance. York nodded slowly. Let them. But humanity will stand its ground. We'll prove that we don't need to bow to anyone. Meanwhile, the council was still reeling from the rejection. The Vrethka, once the galaxy's mediators, found themselves divided. Some were appalled by humanity's refusal to cooperate, while others saw their actions as an opportunity for a more inclusive future. Sorix, their chief representative, found himself increasingly isolated. He had hoped for a peaceful resolution, but the Xalcor and other warlike factions saw this as a chance to assert their control over humanity. They argued that any refusal to join the council's terms should be met with force. I warned them, Drakta sneered, his red eyes burning with contempt. They are too weak, too stubborn to understand the galaxy's true order. The human race will learn that respect is earned through power, not defiance. Sorix stood, his gaze distant. Perhaps, but we cannot force cooperation. If we take aggressive action against humanity, we risk more than just a war. We risk losing the very principles that hold this council together. The debate among the council grew heated, with each side digging in their heels. Some saw humanity's rejection as a rebellion, while others viewed it as an assertion of strength that could reshape the galaxy's future. The future of the Galactic Council seemed uncertain, but one thing was clear. Humanity had become a force that could no longer be ignored. Back on Earth, York received a private message from a familiar face, a leader of one of the independent systems that had offered its support. "We stand with you, Ambassador," the message read. "The galaxy may be fractured, but we see what you see. There is power in standing firm, and we will not let the Council push us around any longer." York looked out the window again, her thoughts racing. The road ahead would not be easy. The galaxy's power dynamics were shifting, and humanity was no longer a passive player in this cosmic chess game. For the first time, they had the galaxy's attention. Now, it was up to them to decide how they would use it. In the wake of humanity's bold rejection of the Galactic Council's offer, tensions began to mount. The council chambers were filled with heated debates, but the real action was happening beyond the confines of the council itself. The Xal Corps, furious at what they saw as an affront to their authority, began to move. Their fleet, massive and imposing, silently advanced toward human space, hidden in the vastness of uncharted space. They were not going to wait for a formal declaration of war. They would strike first. Ambassador York, back on Earth, had no idea the Xal Corps were already moving. But she knew something was coming. The messages from her allies, the smaller factions that had rallied to humanity's side, spoke of growing unrest. The Xal Corps had been watching, waiting for an excuse to challenge humanity's defiance. What York didn't know was that their fleet, under the guise of routine patrols, had already entered human-controlled space. Admiral Harris was the first to catch wind of it. As he sat in his command center, the faint hum of the communications equipment in the background, an alert flashed across his screen. A scout ship, one of humanity's most advanced reconnaissance vessels, had picked up several unknown ships on the outer edge of human space. They were massive, far larger than anything humanity had encountered before. The Xal Corps had arrived. "Admiral," the voice of a junior officer broke through his thoughts. "We've confirmed it. The Xal Corps fleet is moving in. They've crossed the border, and they're heading toward our colonies." Harris' heart raced. He knew the Xal Corps well enough to understand their tactics. They were aggressive, not interested in negotiations. The fleet wasn't just on a reconnaissance mission. This was an act of provocation. He turned to his second-in-command. "Prepare the fleet for defense," Harris ordered, his voice sharp. "We're not going to let them march through our space without a response." As his orders were quickly relayed, Harris turned his attention to a secure comm line to Ambassador York. Her face appeared on the screen, her expression calm but expectant. "Admiral, what's happening?" she asked, her voice betraying no hint of panic. "It's the Xal Corps, ma'am," Harris said. "They've crossed the border, and they're heading straight for the colony at Valora 7. It looks like they're ready for a confrontation." York's expression hardened. She had anticipated tension, but this was a step further. The Xal Corps weren't just posturing. They were testing humanity, pushing them into a corner. But York refused to be intimidated. She had been clear in her rejection of the Council's terms, and now it seemed the Xal Corps were forcing her hand. "We can't let them just walk over us," York said, her voice steady but fierce. "Prepare our forces, but we will not fire unless we are fired upon." Harris nodded, understanding the weight of her decision. "Understood. We'll make sure they know we're ready, but we'll hold back unless we're left with no other choice." The fleet began to assemble, a blend of human ships and the support of their newfound allies. It wasn't the largest force, but it was more than enough to send a message. Humanity was not a race to be crushed under the boot of the Xal Corps. They would not bend or break under pressure. Meanwhile, on the Xal Corps flagship, Commander Ragnar stood before his command center. His eyes narrowed as he watched the human fleet take shape on his sensors. The Xal Corps had been waiting for a sign of weakness from humanity, and now they had one. He could feel the satisfaction building inside him. They had refused to submit, and now humanity would learn the consequences of defiance. "We strike first," Ragnar growled, turning to his officers. If they want a war, they'll get one. The tension in human space was rising. York could feel it, the quiet before the storm. The fleet was ready, but what came next would determine not only the future of humanity, but the entire course of galactic history. The first shots might not have been fired yet, but in the dark reaches of space, humanity was already preparing for what would be a defining moment. The vast expanse of space was a dark, silent theater, where the only sound was the steady hum of the human fleet as it moved into position. The ships, a mix of sleek warships and makeshift cruisers, were arrayed in a defensive formation around the Valora 7 colony, a small but strategically important outpost in human space. Ambassador York watched the live feed from Earth, her hands clasped behind her back. She knew that the next few hours would decide everything. She had chosen not to strike first. Humanity had not been the aggressor in this conflict, but the Xal Corps had forced her hand. Their fleet was now within range, and the tension was palpable. "We're in position," Admiral Harris reported over the secure comlink. "The fleet is ready, and we've got full sensor coverage. The Xal Corps are closing in on Valora 7. York's heart raced, but she held her composure. "Do not engage unless they fire first," she ordered, her voice calm but resolute. "We are not the ones starting this war." On the bridge of the Xal Corps flagship, Commander Ragnar paced back and forth, his gaze fixed on the human fleet. His ships were massive, their dark hulls glistening against the backdrop of distant stars. The Xal Corps had been the undisputed military power in the galaxy for centuries, and the sight of their forces arrayed in front of the humans should have been enough to intimidate them. Yet, the humans refused to back down. "Target the human ships," Ragnar barked to his tactical officer. "Destroy their defenses, and then we will send a message to their pathetic leaders." "Commander, we're receiving a transmission," the officer replied, his voice tense. "It's from the human ambassador, Ambassador York." Ragnar paused, surprised. "What do they want?" The officer activated the comm screen, and York's face appeared, her expression unwavering. "Commander Ragnar," York said, her voice cutting through the cold silence of space, "I urge you to reconsider your actions. This is not the way forward. Humanity does not seek conflict, but we will defend our people. Do not force us into a war." Ragnar sneered at the image. "You misunderstand, Ambassador. This is not about negotiation. Your refusal to cooperate with the Council is a direct threat to the order of the galaxy. You will learn your place soon enough." York's eyes flashed with a mixture of defiance and determination. "We are not your subjects. Humanity will never kneel to anyone. If you want war, you will have one. But it is not too late to turn back." The Xal Corps commander's gaze hardened. He had heard enough. He signaled to his tactical officer. "Open fire." The sound of weapons charging filled the bridge of the Xal Corps flagship, and before York could react, the first salvo of energy blasts shot out, streaking across the void toward the human fleet. The dark emptiness of space was suddenly alight with the fury of war. "Incoming," Harris shouted from the command center, his voice filled with urgency. "Brace for impact." The human fleet was quick to respond, their own weapons coming online as they raised their shields in defense. The first few shots from the Xal Corps hit, rocking the human ships with the force of the impact. The colony at Valora 7, vulnerable and unprepared for such an attack, experienced a massive power surge as energy rippled through the nearby system. "Return fire," Harris barked. "Target their weapons systems. Disable their fleet if you can." Human ships returned fire with coordinated precision, the energy beams cutting through the dark void toward the Xal Corps vessels. Though they were outmatched in terms of sheer firepower, humanity's fleet had the advantage of speed and agility. The human ships weaved and darted through the oncoming fire, avoiding the heaviest hits while delivering their own blows. The battle raged on, the tension thick in the air. Each strike, each blast of energy, echoed the deep divide between the two forces. Humanity was fighting not just for survival, but for the future of their species in the stars. Back on Earth, York watched as the battle unfolded on her screen, her thoughts racing. This was no longer just about rejecting a peace proposal. It was about showing the galaxy that humanity would not be silenced, would not be intimidated, and would not be pushed aside. The fight for Valoris 7 was only the beginning. The battle for Valoris 7 raged on, but the tide was beginning to shift. Humanity's fleet, despite being outmatched in terms of raw firepower, was proving far more agile and resourceful than the Xal Corps had anticipated. The human ships, though not as heavily armored as the Xal Corps, were maneuvering with precision, using their smaller size and faster engines to stay out of the worst of the barrage. The Xal Corps, for all their might, were struggling to keep up with the relentless human counterattacks. "Keep the pressure on them," Admiral Harris barked, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We've got them on the back foot. Do not give them a chance to regroup." In the midst of the chaos, York stood by her desk, watching the battle unfold through the live feed from the command center. Her heart was heavy with every strike, but she knew this was the only path forward. The Xal Corps had forced their hand, and humanity was now showing that it would not bow to anyone, not even the mightiest military force in the galaxy. On the Xal Corps flagship, Ragnar growled in frustration. His ships were being battered from all sides by human fire, and the human fleet's resilience was becoming increasingly evident. His tactical officers were struggling to find a way to break through their defenses. "Increase firepower," Ragnar ordered, his voice full of rage. "Focus everything on the human flagship. If we break their command ship, the rest will fall into line." The Xal Corps fleet shifted their focus, and a concentrated barrage of energy beams slammed into the human flagship, the Victory. The ship's shields flared brightly as they absorbed the blows, but the strain was starting to show. Systems began to fail, and the crew worked furiously to maintain control. The energy spikes on the ship's systems were growing, but they were not about to give up. "Shields at 40%, one of the officers shouted. "We need to power up the backup systems, now. Get us a clear shot." Harris ordered, his mind working on instinct. "If we don't stop them now, it's only a matter of time before they overwhelm us." As the Xal Corps focused their fire on the Victory, they failed to notice the shifting tactics of the other human ships. Smaller human vessels, coordinated by a mix of skilled pilots and tactical commanders, launched a series of surprise attacks. A volley of torpedoes and energy blasts ripped through the gaps in the Xal Corps formation, tearing into their ships with a deadly precision. Direct hit to their flagship. One of the human officers shouted in triumph. "We've taken down one of their main weapons arrays." Ragnar, watching the damage unfold on his ship's systems, felt his control slipping. His fleet had underestimated the resolve and adaptability of humanity. The human ships were using tactics that were foreign to the Xal Corps, fast, unpredictable, and highly effective. His frustration grew as his fleet struggled to regain the upper hand. On the surface of Valoris 7, the residents were huddled in shelters, listening to the distant sounds of battle in the sky above. Though the planet was far from the front lines, the shockwaves from the explosions were felt in every corner. For them, the battle was an abstract concept, a distant war that they could only watch and pray about. But for York, it was personal. Valoris 7 was more than just a colony. It was a symbol of humanity's future in the galaxy. "We're holding them off," Harris reported, his voice a mix of exhaustion and resolve. "But they're not retreating. We're going to need reinforcements if we're going to finish this." York knew that this wasn't just a battle for Valoris 7, it was a battle for humanity's place in the galaxy. If they could drive the Xal Corps back here, it would send a message to the rest of the galaxy that humanity could stand up to anyone, regardless of their power. "We'll hold," York said firmly. "Humanity will not back down. Not now, not ever." As the battle continued, the human forces held strong. The Xal Corps were relentless, but the spirit of the human fleet, driven by necessity, defiance, and an unyielding will to survive, was becoming an unstoppable force. The conflict at Valora 7 would become the defining moment in human history, the point where they had proved they were more than just an upstart species on the fringes of the galaxy. They had become a force to be reckoned with. But this was only the beginning. The galaxy had been watching. The winds of change were stirring, and the course of history was now in the hands of humanity. The battle for Valora 7 had raged for hours, but humanity's determination had turned the tide. The Xalcor, once so confident in their superior firepower, were now struggling to hold their ground. The human fleet, battered but unbowed, had delivered a series of devastating blows to their enemies, and the Xalcor flagship was now listing, its weapons disabled, and its shields down. Direct hit to their main reactor. One of the officers on the human flagship shouted, her voice full of excitement. They're losing power across the fleet. Admiral Harris allowed himself a brief moment of relief. Keep up the pressure. This isn't over until they retreat. On the Xalcor flagship, Ragnar paced angrily, watching as his fleet crumbled around him. The human fleet's unyielding resistance had caught him off guard. He had expected them to break under the first wave of attacks, but instead, they had fought back with the ferocity of cornered animals. Prepare to retreat, Ragnar growled, his tone dark with fury. We can't win this fight. Withdraw the fleet. His officers scrambled to follow orders, but the damage had been done. The Xalcor fleet, once a symbol of galactic might, was now in disarray. A few stragglers fired off one last desperate volley, but it was clear that the battle was lost. Within moments, the remaining Xalcor ships began to warp out of the system, leaving behind a trail of destruction. Their retreat was swift, but humanity had won the day. Back on Earth, Ambassador York stood in front of the large screen, watching as the last of the Xalcor ships vanished from the system. Her eyes remained fixed on the display, the weight of the moment heavy in her chest. The battle was over, but the war, if it could even be called that, was far from finished. The Xalcor might have retreated, but their message was clear. Humanity would no longer be ignored. Victory, Ambassador, Admiral Harris's voice crackled through the comm. We've pushed them back. The Xalcor are gone for now. York exhaled slowly. We've done more than that, Harris. We've shown the galaxy who we are. Despite the victory, there was no time for celebration. The aftermath of the battle was already beginning to unfold. The Council would be watching closely, and the smaller factions that had supported humanity would now be looking for assurance that this newfound strength wasn't just a fluke. Humanity had proven they could hold their own, but the galaxy was a complicated place, and alliances were as fragile as they were necessary. In the days following the battle, messages poured in from independent systems and smaller factions, offering congratulations and support. Some saw humanity's victory as the beginning of a new era, where the smaller species of the galaxy could rise up and demand a fairer place in the galactic order. Others were more cautious, warning that the Xalcor would likely return with more force, and that humanity should be ready for the consequences. A meeting was called between York and the leaders of the independent factions who had stood by humanity during the conflict. The location was neutral, a small moon orbiting a gas giant on the fringes of human-controlled space. As York stepped into the meeting room, she was greeted by representatives from several races, some familiar, others new. Their faces were filled with hope, but also with uncertainty. "We've seen what you can do," said Rylus, the leader of a trade-based species known as the Aurelians. "But we also know that the Xalcor won't back down forever. They've never forgotten a defeat." York nodded, her expression serious. "I know. But what you've seen today is more than just a battle. It's a message to the galaxy. Humanity is no longer a passive observer. We are willing to fight for our place here." Another leader, a T-Corps diplomat named Frelka, added, "And that's why we're here. We've been watching, waiting for someone to stand up to the old powers. We believe in your cause, Ambassador York. If you'll have us, we are ready to stand with you." The room fell silent as York took a moment to consider the words. The weight of the decision was not lost on her. This wasn't just about defeating the Xalcor. It was about forging a new future for the galaxy. A future where no one species held the reins of power, where humanity could stand alongside others as equals. Finally, York spoke, her voice calm but resolute. We will stand together. The time has come to change the balance of power in the galaxy. But we must be ready. The Xalcor won't be the only ones who will test us. With that, the foundation for a new alliance was set. The first step toward a new future had been taken. The winds of change were no longer just a whisper. They were a force, and they were beginning to sweep through the galaxy. In the weeks following the battle for Valora 7, the galaxy began to stir. The Xalcor had retreated, but their defeat was far from forgotten. The galaxy's power structure had been shaken, and for the first time in centuries, the smaller species, those who had been silenced under the weight of the Council's decisions, dared to imagine a future where they could stand equal to the established powers. Humanity's victory had sparked something deeper than just hope. It had ignited a movement. Ambassador York, now more than ever, found herself at the center of a new political storm. As she sat in her office on Earth, she reflected on how quickly things had changed. The peaceful life she had once known was slipping further away with every passing day. Ambassador York, you have a message from the Zashari delegation, her aide said, interrupting her thoughts. York straightened. The Zashari were one of the galaxy's oldest and most secretive species, and their sudden interest in humanity was both surprising and significant. Put them through, York replied, her voice steady. The screen flickered to life, and the face of Zashari Ambassador Cathor appeared. His features were angular, almost ethereal, and his black eyes glinted with an unreadable expression. Ambassador York, Cathor began, his voice low but filled with purpose. We have been watching your rise with great interest. The events at Valora 7 were enlightening. Humanity has proven itself capable of standing against powers far greater than yourselves. The Zashari are ready to offer you a proposition. York listened intently, her curiosity piqued. What kind of proposition? We seek an alliance, Cathor said simply. A union between the Zashari and humanity could change the balance of power across the galaxy. Together, we would be a force no one could challenge. The room seemed to grow quieter as York processed the words. The Zashari were known for their intelligence and cunning, but they rarely formed alliances with other species. The idea of them seeking humanity out was significant. It was clear the galaxy was changing, and humanity was at the center of it all. And what does the Zashari want in return? York asked carefully. Cathor's gaze hardened, though he remained poised. We ask for your support in the coming negotiations with the Galactic Council. We have our differences with them, but we believe that together we can reshape the Council into something more equitable. Your voice, Ambassador York, is now one of great power. With humanity's support, we can sway the Council's decisions in ways that have never been possible before. York took a moment before responding. She had known that the rise of humanity would bring challenges, but she had not anticipated such immediate and far-reaching consequences. The Zashari were a wild card, and their alliance could either elevate humanity's position in the galaxy or drag them into even greater conflict. We'll need time to consider this, she said at last. But we are open to discussions. We understand that the path forward is one of collaboration, but also caution. Cathor's lips curled into a faint smile. I expected nothing less, Ambassador. We will wait for your answer. The screen flickered off, and York was left in silence, pondering the weight of what had just transpired. The offer from the Zashari was an opportunity, but it was also a challenge. Aligning with such a powerful and enigmatic species would undoubtedly alter humanity's trajectory in ways they could not yet foresee. Meanwhile, the small but growing coalition of species that had stood with humanity during the conflict continued to gather strength. Representatives from independent factions, long oppressed by the larger powers, now looked to York as their leader. They saw in her the potential for a future where the galaxy was not ruled by a few, but by many, a galaxy where the voices of the marginalized would finally be heard. Humanity's victory at Valora 7 had sent shockwaves through the galaxy, but the aftermath was still unfolding. The Council, already weakened by its inability to maintain control over the galaxy's power dynamics, would have to adapt. Humanity was no longer a passive observer. It had taken its first steps toward becoming a key player in galactic politics. As York stood by her office window, gazing out at the sprawling city below, she knew that the hard work had only just begun. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, betrayals, and difficult decisions. But for the first time, humanity had a seat at the table, and that was only the beginning. The galaxy was changing, and humanity, for the first time in its history, had a chance to shape its future.